Hello and welcome back to another EDH deck tech idea. Today I'm featuring the Gitrog Ravenous Ride. It is a 5 mana 6/5 with trample and haste, and whenever the Gitrog Ravenous Ride deals combat damage to a player, you may sacrifice a creature that settled it this turn. If you do, draw X cards, then put up to X land cards from your hand onto the battlefield tapped, where X is the sacrificed creature's power. Every creature with power greater than 1 can settle the Gitrog, but you can be sure of one thing: we wanna settle and sacrifice creatures that have way higher power than 1. For example, Vaultborn Tyrant, a 7 mana 6/6 with trample, and whenever Vaultborn Tyrant or another creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, you gain free life and draw a card. When Vaultborn Tyrant dies, if it's not a token, create a token that's a copy of it, except it's an artifact in addition to its other types. This creature does everything in its deck. It is a threat on its own, it draws you cards, it gains you life, and when you settle the Gitrog with this creature and sacrifice it to the Gitrog's ability, you will draw 6 cards and you will also get a token of Vaultborn Tyrant. Ghalta Primal Hunger, a 12 mana 12/12, and this spell costs X less to cast, where X is the total power of creatures you control, and it also has trample. In the most cases, Ghalta won't even attack in this deck because we wanna settle the Gitrog with this one and draw 12 cards after we've connected. Rotting Regisaur, a 3 mana 7/6, and at the beginning of your upkeep discard a card. This is a very cheap and high power creature which is great in this deck, as we will sacrifice it after the Gitrog has connected, so we won't even put ourselves at a disadvantage due to its upkeep trigger. Yargel and Multani, a 6 mana 18/6 with a lot of text on it, but the relevant thing about it is its 18 power stat line, which can draw you 18 cards. And we also play Demogoth Titan, a 4 mana 11/10, and whenever it attacks or blocks, sacrifice a creature. You can bring this one out on turn 4 and do nothing with it, and on turn 5 you can bring out the Gitrog, settle it with the Demogoth Titan and attack and draw 11 cards. Another really cool card is Demogoth Woe Eater, a 4 mana 7/6, and at the beginning of your upkeep sacrifice a creature. When you sacrifice Demogoth Woe Eater, each opponent discards a card, you draw a card and you gain 2 life. So once the Gitrog got settled with this creature, you will sacrifice it on the connect trigger, so you won't even be put into a disadvantage with the upkeep trigger, and you will draw even more advantage from the Demogoth Woe Eater dying. And now I want to present you a few of my favorite enchantments in this deck. For example, Greater Good, a 4 mana enchantment that says sacrifice a creature and draw cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power, then discard 3 cards. Well, here's the thing, your opponents know how powerful it is when the Gitrog connects, so they might target some removal at it, and in response you can still sacrifice it into Greater Good to draw some more advantage before the removal resolves. Furthermore, I have just talked about a few creatures that have negative effects for you, so even if that is about to happen, you can sacrifice those creatures into Greater Good and draw a lot of advantage from it. So it is definitely a great insurance for this deck. Retreat to Hagara, a 3 mana enchantment with landfall, and whenever land enters the battlefield under your control, choose 1. Target creature gets +1/+0 and gains Death Touch until end of turn, or each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Depending on how many lands you can put onto the battlefield with the Gitrog trigger, you can drain your opponents for a bunch, or power up a creature in your pre-combat main phase to make the Gitrog even more threatening. Death's Presence, a 6 mana enchantment, and whenever a creature you control dies, put X +1/+1 counters on target creature you control, where X is the power of that creature that died. This can turn into a really powerful threat, as you can also kick out a player with commander damage, and Death Presence definitely helps with that. Unnatural Growth, a 5 mana enchantment, and at the beginning of each combat, double the power and toughness of each creature you control until end of turn. Settling only works as sorcery speed, but it doesn't matter as the power of the settled creature still gets doubled at the beginning of each combat, and the trigger of the Gitrog happens post damage, so you can still sacrifice the creature with its doubled power. Virtue of Persistence, a 7 mana enchantment, and at the beginning of your upkeep put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. It also has a sorcery side for 2 mana, and target creature gets -3/-3 until end of turn and you gain 2 life. Virtue of Persistence is extremely versatile for its early game and late game power, and due to the fact that you have to sacrifice the settled creature to get the deconnect trigger, you can get another creature back in your upkeep to settle the Gitrog again. Zendika's Royal, a 5 mana enchantment with landfall, whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a 2/2 green elemental creature token. Now I'd like to feature a few cards that will definitely help you to accelerate your game plan. For example, Druid class, a 2 mana enchantment class, and on the first level, whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. For 3 mana you can level it to level 2 and you may play an additional land on each of your turns. It costs 5 mana to bring it to level 5, and when this class becomes level 3, target land you control becomes a creature with haste, and this creature's power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands you control. It's still a land. Tiller Engine, a 2 mana 1/3, and whenever a land enters the battlefield tapped and under your control, choose one. Either untap that land or tap target non-land permanent an opponent controls. Tireless Provisioner, a 3 mana 3/2 with landfall, and whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a food token or treasure token. This one is great as you can bring it out in the early game and from every land drop create a treasure token and accelerate your game plan, as the Gitrog itself is already a 5 mana commander and those creatures that you want to settle it with do also have their mana costs. Amulet of Vigor, a 1 mana artifact, and whenever a permanent enters the battlefield tapped and under your control, untap it. This one is great as you can profit from all of those lands that enter due to the Gitrog's trigger become untapped, and you will have a lot of mana available in your post-combat main phase. Lotus Cobra, a 2 mana 2/1 with landfall, and whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, add 1 mana of any color. Nissa of Shadowed Bows, a 4 mana 4 loyalty planeswalker with landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, put a loyalty counter on Nissa Shadowed Bows. Her +1 says, untap target land you control, you may have it become a 3/3 elemental creature with haste and menace until end of turn, it's still a land. Her -5 ability says, you may put a creature card with converted mana cost less than or equal to the number of lands you control onto the battlefield from your hand or graveyard with 2 +1/+1 counters on it. I personally have never seen that Nissa gets played in Commander, but especially in this deck I think she can become a really powerful planeswalker, as you can put creatures from your hand or your graveyard onto the battlefield, and with Gitrog's Connect trigger she can get a lot of loyalty counters. You want to win more? You get it. Greensleeves Marrow Sorcerer. A 5 mana XX and protection from planeswalkers and from wizards. Greensleeves Marrow Sorcerer's power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands you control. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a 3/3 green badger creature token. Just as with Zendika's Royal, you can create an army of creature tokens to win the game in your next turn. Obnixilis the Fallen, a 5 mana 3/3 with landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may have target player lose 3 life. If you do, put 3 +1/+1 counters on Obnixilis the Fallen. If Obnixilis sees a lot of lands enter the battlefield under your control, you can make your opponents lose a lot of life and prepare Obnixilis to settle the Gitrog in the following turn with a lot of power. The Skullspawn Nexus, an 8 mana legendary artifact, and this spell costs X less to cast, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. Whenever one or more non-token creatures you control die, create a green fungus dinosaur creature token with base power and toughness each equal to the total power of those creatures. For 2 generic and tapping it, double target creature's power until end of turn. The Skullspawn Nexus is definitely one of your win cons in this deck, as it loops all of your high powered creatures into creature tokens, and due to the Gitrog having trample and haste, you can also double its power to win with commander damage if necessary. Psychosis Crawler, a 5 mana XX, and Psychosis Crawler's power and toughness are each equal to the number of cards in your hand. Whenever you draw a card, each opponent loses 1 life. Psychosis Crawler can machine gun down your opponents when you sacrifice the settled creature and draw a bunch of cards. Avenger of Zendika, a 7 mana 5/5, and when it enters the battlefield, create a 0/1 green plant creature token for each land you control. It has the landfall mechanic, so whenever land enters the battlefield under your control, you may put a 1/1 counter on each plant creature you control. And last but not least, Bristly Bill's Spine Sower, a 2 mana 2/2 with landfall. Whenever land enters the battlefield under your control, put a 1/1 counter on target creature. For 5 mana, you can double the number of +1/+1 counters on each creature you control. Imagine having Tiller Engine or Amulet of Vigor on the battlefield, connecting with the Gitrog, putting a bunch of lands into play and having a lot of mana available to use this ability right afterwards before your next turn to win the game. Alright guys, these were a few cards that I will play in the Gitrog Ravenous Ride. Let me know which cards you would add to the deck, which legendary creature I shall feature next, and then I would say see you in the next one. Goodbye guys.